Everyone ignored poor Auntie on New Year. At midnight, she changed their lives. The Harrison family mansion blazed with golden light against the December night sky. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across marble floors, while a string quartet played softly in the corner of the grand ballroom. Designer dresses swirled past tailored suits as the city's elite mingled. Champagne flutes perpetually full, laughter ringing artificial and bright. It was New Year's Eve, and the Harrisons were throwing their annual celebration, the event everyone who was anyone fought to attend. In the midst of all this opulence, one figure sat alone in the corner of the terrace, wrapped in a threadbare cardigan despite the winter chill. Aunt Margaret, 72 years old, watched the festivities through the French doors with eyes that had seen too much disappointment to expect anything different. "Mom, why is she even here?" Victoria Harrison hissed to her mother, Eleanor, as they stood near the champagne fountain. Victoria's diamond earrings caught the light as she tossed her perfectly highlighted hair. "She's wearing that awful sweater again. What will the Montgomerys think?" Eleanor Harrison, the family matriarch, barely glanced in her sister-in-law's direction. "Your father insisted. You know how he gets sentimental around the holidays. Something about family. Just ignore her. Everyone else will." And ignore her they did. Margaret had arrived at 6 o'clock, taking the bus from her tiny apartment across town. She'd brought a homemade apple pie, her specialty, and placed it carefully on the dessert table. Within minutes, one of the caterers had whisked it away, replacing it with an elaborate French patisserie creation. Margaret had watched her pie disappear into the kitchen, swallowing the small hurt that lodged in her throat. It was always like this. 20 years ago, Margaret had been different. She'd been Margaret Harrison, married to Thomas Harrison, Eleanor's husband's younger brother. The Harrisons had been a close family then, before the money, before the mansion, before everything changed. She and Thomas had lived simply but happily, teachers at the local elementary school, content with their small house and smaller bank account. Then Thomas had died suddenly, a heart attack at 49. And Margaret had discovered that their life insurance had lapsed, that their savings were minimal, that she was alone and unprepared for the financial reality of widowhood. She'd asked her brother-in-law, Richard Harrison, for help. Just temporary, she'd promised, just until she got back on her feet. Richard had refused. "We can't enable dependence, Margaret," he'd said from behind his mahogany desk, barely looking up from his paperwork. "You'll never learn to stand on your own if we keep bailing you out. It's for your own good." Eleanor had been even less sympathetic. "Honestly, Margaret, you're still young enough to work. Pull yourself together." They'd offered her nothing, no loan, no job at one of Richard's companies, not even a spare room in their 7-bedroom mansion. Just advice about personal responsibility and financial planning. Margaret had pulled herself together, as Eleanor had suggested. She'd worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, working retail during the day, and tutoring children on weekends. She'd moved to a studio apartment in the cheapest part of town. She'd learned what it meant to choose between heating and eating, between medicine and rent. And through it all, the Harrisons had grown richer. Richard's investment firm had exploded. They'd moved from their comfortable suburban home to this mansion. Victoria had attended private schools, then Yale. Their son, Marcus, had been given a six-figure starting position at his father's company, despite barely graduating from college. Their youngest, Sophia, was planning a destination wedding that cost more than Margaret earned in 5 years. But they still invited her to family events, not out of love, but out of obligation. A checkbox on Eleanor's perfect life list. Include poor relations occasionally to demonstrate humility. Auntie Margaret! A small voice broke through her thoughts. Margaret looked up to see 7-year-old Emma, Marcus's daughter, standing beside her. Emma was the only Harrison who still saw her, really saw her. "Hello, sweetheart." Margaret's face softened as she made room on the bench. "Aren't you supposed to be inside with the other children?" "It's boring." Emma plopped down beside her, her fancy party dress crinkling. "Everyone's just talking about money and stuff. Dad's on his phone, Mom's talking to her friends. Nobody's playing games or telling stories or anything fun." "New Year's Eve isn't always fun for children," Margaret agreed gently. "Why don't you come inside, Auntie? It's freezing out here." Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter. "I'm all right, dear. I like the quiet." "They're ignoring you again, aren't they?" Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but her small hand found Margaret's. "I heard Grandma tell the caterers not to serve you the good appetizers. That's mean." Margaret's throat tightened. "Sometimes grown-ups are unkind, Emma, but that doesn't mean you should be." "I won't be. I'll never be mean like them." Emma leaned against Margaret's shoulder. "Tell me a story, like you used to?" When Emma was younger, Margaret used to babysit her occasionally, until Eleanor had decided that Margaret's apartment was unsuitable and hired a proper nanny instead. But Emma had never forgotten those afternoons filled with stories and homemade cookies and genuine laughter. Margaret was just beginning a tale about a brave little girl who befriended a dragon when Marcus appeared at the terrace door. "Emma, get inside, now!" His voice was sharp, embarrassed. "Stop bothering Aunt Margaret." "I'm not bothering her. We're inside. Your mother is looking for you." Emma squeezed Margaret's hand apologetically before scurrying inside. Marcus didn't even look at Margaret before following his daughter, the door clicking shut with finality. Margaret sat alone again, watching her breath mist in the cold air. Inside, the party grew louder as midnight approached. Someone had turned up the music. The champagne flowed more freely. Victoria was showing off her new engagement ring, 5 carats, she announced to anyone within earshot. Sophia was on her phone, FaceTiming her fiancé from whatever tropical location he was visiting. Marcus had joined his father and several businessmen in the study, discussing market trends and portfolio diversification. Eleanor Harrison surveyed her domain with satisfaction. Everything was perfect. The flowers, the food, the guest list, the ambiance. This was what success looked like. This was what happened when you made smart choices, married well, invested wisely. Not like Margaret, who'd married for love and ended up in poverty. 10 minutes to midnight, someone called out. The crowd began congregating in the ballroom, drawn to the massive windows overlooking the city skyline where they'd watch the fireworks. Servers circulated with fresh champagne flutes. The countdown clock appeared on the enormous television screen. On the terrace, Margaret checked her watch, an old Timex that had belonged to Thomas. Nearly midnight. She should probably go inside, at least for the countdown. It seemed rude to stay outside, even if no one had spoken to her all evening. She stood, her joints protesting the cold, and reached for the door handle. It didn't turn. Margaret tried again. Locked. She knocked gently, then harder. But inside, the music and conversation were too loud. No one heard, or if they did, they didn't care. Through the glass, she could see her family, laughing, drinking, celebrating, living their glittering lives while she stood outside in the cold, literally and metaphorically shut out. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart. That had broken years ago. This was something different. Something that had been bending and bending under the weight of indignity and disrespect and casual cruelty, and had finally reached its breaking point. She stepped back from the door, and then she heard it, a soft chiming from her old handbag. She pulled out her phone, expecting a generic Happy New Year text from her phone company. Instead, there was a notification from her bank. Unusual account activity. Please review immediately. Margaret frowned. She had maybe $247 in her checking account. What unusual activity could there possibly be? She opened her banking app, her cold fingers fumbling with the buttons, and froze. Her account balance read $47,500, $247. Margaret blinked again. The number didn't change. $47,500,247. Her phone chimed again. An email this time, from a law firm she'd never heard of. Whitmore, Stanton and Associates. Dear Mrs. Margaret Harrison, we are pleased to inform you that as per the instructions in the last will and testament of Dmitry Volkov, you have been named the sole beneficiary of his estate. Mr. Volkov passed away 3 months ago, and after the required legal proceedings, his assets have now been transferred to your account. Mr. Volkov left the following message for you. For the teacher who saw a scared immigrant boy when everyone else saw a problem. For the kindness that changed a life. I never forgot. The estate includes liquid assets of $47.5 million, as well as property holdings, stock portfolios, and other investments, which we will detail in our upcoming meeting. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the full extent of your inheritance and finalize all necessary documentation. Sincerely, Jonathan Whitmore, Senior Partner. Margaret's hands shook as she read the message twice, 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Dmitry Volkov. The name tumbled through her memory, landing finally on a small, dark-haired boy from over 30 years ago. She'd been teaching 3rd grade then, and Dmitry had arrived mid-year, a Ukrainian immigrant who spoke almost no English, whose clothes were worn, whose eyes were haunted by things no 8-year-old should have seen. The other teachers had complained about him. He was behind. He didn't understand instructions. He disrupted class. They'd wanted him placed in special education, tracked away where he wouldn't bring down their test scores. Margaret had fought for him. She'd stayed late every day, teaching him English, helping him catch up. She'd bought him notebooks and pencils with her own money. She'd packed extra sandwiches in her lunch and casually left them where he'd find them. She'd seen his potential when everyone else saw a burden. She'd almost forgotten him, one student among thousands over her career, but he hadn't forgotten her. Inside the mansion, someone started counting down. 10, 9, 8. Margaret stared at her phone at the impossible number on her screen, at this message from the past that had just rewritten her future. 7, 6, 5. She looked through the glass at her family, the people who had turned their backs when she needed them most, who had treated her poverty as a moral failing, who had literally locked her out in the cold. 4, 3, 2. Margaret's finger hovered over her phone. She could call them. She could knock on the glass. She could tell them. She could watch their faces change from disdain to greed, from dismissal to desperate attention. 1. Happy New Year! Fireworks exploded over the city skyline, painting the sky in brilliant colors. And Margaret smiled, a slow, genuine smile that felt strange on her face after so many years of swallowing hurt. She turned and walked away from the mansion, down the curved driveway to the street. She'd call an Uber from her phone. No more buses. She'd go home to her tiny apartment for tonight. Tomorrow, everything would be different. But she didn't call out, didn't knock, didn't tell them. Let them discover it on their own. Inside the mansion, the celebration continued. It was several minutes before anyone noticed that Aunt Margaret was gone. "Where's your aunt?" Richard asked Eleanor as they clinked champagne glasses. Eleanor glanced toward the terrace. Empty. "She probably left. You know how she is. Can't handle being around success. It makes her uncomfortable." "Probably took the last bus?" Victoria added with a laugh. "God, can you imagine taking public transportation on New Year's Eve?" They all laughed, dismissing Margaret from their minds as easily as they dismissed her from their lives. None of them could have imagined that outside, Margaret was climbing into a luxury car, her life transformed at the stroke of midnight. None of them could have known that the tides had just turned in ways they couldn't fathom. The story was far from over. It was just beginning. Part 2. The Morning After. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her studio apartment, worn furniture, peeling paint, a heater that rattled but barely worked, and stared at her phone. Every few minutes, she refreshed her banking app, certain the number would change, that it had all been a mistake, or a dream, or a cruel joke. The number stayed the same, $47,247. At 3:00 a.m., she finally called the law firm's emergency number, listed at the bottom of the email. "Whitmore, Stanton and Associates, this is the answering service." "Yes, hello, I received an email about an inheritance from Dmitry Volkov. I need to know if this is real." "Your name, please?" "Margaret Harrison." A pause, typing, then, "Yes, Mrs. Harrison, we have you in our system. Mr. Whitmore left instructions that you might call. He wants you to know this is absolutely legitimate. He'll meet with you tomorrow, well, today now, at 2 p.m. if that works for you. Would you like the address?" Margaret wrote it down with shaking hands. It was real. She was a millionaire. No, she was worth nearly $50 million. The tears came then. Great, heaving sobs that she'd been holding back for 20 years. Tears for Thomas, who hadn't lived to see this day. Tears for all the nights she'd gone hungry, all the winters she'd shivered, all the humiliations she'd endured. Tears of relief so profound it felt like drowning. But also, and this surprised her, tears of anger. Because where had this been 5 years ago, when she'd developed pneumonia and couldn't afford the antibiotics? Where had this been 10 years ago, when she'd had to choose between attending her nephew's wedding or paying her rent. Where had this been 15 years ago, when she'd begged Richard for help and been turned away? The universe had a strange sense of timing. By the time dawn broke over the city, Margaret had made several decisions. First, she would meet with the lawyers and understand the full extent of her inheritance. Second, she would keep this secret for a little while longer. Third, she would test her family. She would see if money really was the only thing they understood. And fourth, most importantly, she would finally live. At 9 a.m., her phone rang. Eleanor. "Margaret? Did you leave last night without saying goodbye?" Margaret kept her voice neutral. "The door was locked. I couldn't get back inside." "Locked? That's impossible. You must have— Well, never mind. Listen, Richard and I wanted to talk to you about something. Can you come by the house this afternoon?" "I have an appointment at 2 p.m. What's this about?" A pause. Margaret could almost hear Eleanor calculating how much to reveal. "It's about Emma. Marcus and Julia are going through some difficulties. They need a nanny for a few weeks. We thought you might be available." "You want me to be Emma's nanny?" "Well, you're not working, are you? And Emma likes you. We'd pay you, of course. Minimum wage, room and board. It would help you out, give you a place to stay, instead of that awful apartment." Margaret closed her eyes. Even now, even phrasing it as a favor to her, they couldn't resist the dig about her apartment. "I'll think about it," she said. "Margaret, we need to know today. Julia's mother was going to do it, but she broke her hip. We're in a bind. Surely you can cancel whatever appointment—" "I'll think about it," Margaret repeated and hung up. She stared at her phone, a small smile playing on her lips. Minimum wage to be a nanny, room and board in the mansion that should have been her home too, when she'd needed it. Oh, the irony was delicious. The law offices of Whitmore, Stanton and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of one of the city's most prestigious buildings. Margaret had walked past it 1,000 times, never imagining she'd enter through the front door instead of cleaning it after hours. Jonathan Whitmore was a distinguished man in his 60s, with kind eyes that reminded Margaret of Dimitri, the boy who'd grown into the man who'd changed her life. "Mrs. Harrison, please sit. Can I offer you anything? Coffee, tea, water?" "Water would be lovely, thank you." As she sipped from a crystal glass, Whitmore opened a leather folder. "I want to start by expressing Mr. Volkoff's profound gratitude for what you did for him. He spoke of you often, especially in his final months. He wanted you to know that you saved his life, not metaphorically, but literally. I only did what any teacher should do. But most didn't, and Dimitri never forgot." Whitmore slid several documents across his desk. "The $47.5 million in your account is just the beginning. There's also a penthouse apartment here in the city, valued at approximately $12 million, a vacation home in the Hamptons, investment properties in 3 states, stock portfolios worth another $30 million. In total, you're looking at assets of approximately $95 million. Margaret's water glass slipped. Whitmore caught it smoothly. "I know it's overwhelming." $95 million? Margaret whispered. "Give or take a few million, depending on market fluctuations. Dimitri built a tech company from nothing. He was brilliant, driven. He sold it 5 years ago for $200 million, invested wisely, and lived modestly himself. He never married, had no children. You were the closest thing to family he had. Why didn't he contact me when he was alive? Whitmore's expression softened. He tried, 3 years ago. But when he found you, when he saw how you were living, he felt responsible. He felt he should have found you sooner, helped you sooner. His instructions were explicit. The inheritance would come after his death, so you could never feel obligated to him, never feel like it was charity. He wanted you to have everything with no strings attached. Margaret pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed. Take your time, Whitmore said gently. We'll help you with everything. Financial advisors, tax attorneys, estate management. Nothing has to be decided today. But I do need you to sign some papers to access the full inheritance. They spent the next 2 hours going through documents. Margaret signed papers until her hand cramped. With each signature, her new reality became more concrete. She owned a penthouse. She had investments. She had a financial advisor named Patricia who would call tomorrow. She had a life she couldn't have imagined 24 hours ago. When she finally left the building, the winter sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Margaret stood on the sidewalk, watching the city rush past, and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 decades. Hope. Her phone buzzed. Eleanor again. We need an answer about Emma. Marcus is willing to go up to $12 an hour to care for her great-niece, to live in the mansion's servant quarters, to be at the family's beck and call. Margaret typed a response. I'll be there tomorrow at 10 p.m. We should talk. Eleanor's reply came quickly. Wonderful. I knew you'd see reason. Wear something presentable. Margaret smiled. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. But tonight, she had one more thing to do. She pulled out her phone and called the number for the penthouse building's concierge. Hello, I'm Margaret Harrison. I'm the new owner of Unit 4701. I'd like to move in tomorrow. Can that be arranged? Of course, Mrs. Harrison. Mr. Volkov left instructions that the apartment should be ready for you at any time. Welcome home. Welcome home. Margaret had been homeless in spirit for so long, she'd forgotten what those words felt like. That night, she packed everything she owned into 3 suitcases. It didn't take long. When you've been poor for 20 years, you learn not to accumulate possessions. Each item had been carefully chosen, kept only because it was necessary or precious. Her teaching certification, framed but worthless now that schools wanted younger teachers. Thomas's watch, photos of them together, back when the future had looked bright. Emma's drawings from when she used to visit. She'd leave the furniture. It had come with the apartment anyway. Tomorrow, she'd step into a new life in a home she actually owned. But first, she had a family meeting to attend. Part 3. The Reckoning. Margaret arrived at the Harrison mansion at exactly 10 a.m., carrying a designer handbag that had cost more than she used to make in a month. She'd spent the morning in her new penthouse, marveling at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the marble countertops, the bathroom that was larger than her old apartment. Then she'd visited several high-end stores, emerging transformed. Her threadbare cardigan was gone, replaced by an elegant cashmere coat. Her worn shoes had been exchanged for Italian leather boots. Her hair, which she'd been cutting herself for years, had been styled at the city's most exclusive salon. She looked in short, like money. When she rang the doorbell, she'd never had a key despite 20 years of family gatherings. It was Victoria who answered. Victoria's eyes widened. Aunt Margaret, I almost didn't recognize you. Did you rob a bank? May I come in? Victoria stepped aside, confusion evident on her face. Mom, Aunt Margaret's here. Eleanor appeared from the living room, Marcus and Sophia trailing behind her. All three stopped dead when they saw her. Margaret, what on earth? Where's Richard? Margaret asked calmly. In his study. He didn't think this meeting required his presence. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, taking in every detail of Margaret's transformation. How can you afford those clothes? That's a Burberry coat. Those are Christian Louboutin boots. Margaret, what's going on? Call Richard down, and Emma too. I'll only say this once. Something in Margaret's tone made Eleanor pull out her phone. Within minutes, Richard descended from his study, annoyed at the interruption. Emma bounded down from the playroom, her face lighting up when she saw Margaret. Auntie, you look like a princess. Thank you, sweetheart. Margaret smiled at the little girl, then turned to the assembled family. Shall we sit? They moved to the living room, the Harrisons taking their usual positions on the expensive furniture, while Margaret remained standing. I came this morning because Eleanor asked me to consider being Emma's nanny, Margaret began. $12 an hour, room and board. Is that still the offer? Margaret, about that, Richard started, but Eleanor cut him off. Yes, that's the offer. We're being generous considering your situation. My situation, Margaret repeated. Tell me, Eleanor, what exactly is my situation? You're 69 years old, living in a studio apartment with no real job prospects. We're offering you stable employment and a place to live. Honestly, you should be grateful. Grateful. Margaret let the word hang in the air. Like I should have been grateful 20 years ago when I asked for help, and you told me to pull myself together? Richard shifted uncomfortably. Margaret, we've been over this. Or maybe I should be grateful for all the times you've invited me to family events and then ignored me, locked me out on terraces. Served me leftover appetizers while your guests got the good food? That's not, Eleanor began, but Margaret raised a hand. I'm not finished. I should be grateful that you offer me minimum wage to care for my great niece, to live in the servants' quarters of a house that has 7 empty bedrooms. Grateful for scraps from the table of a family that has more money than they know what to do with. Where is this coming from? Victoria demanded. And how did you pay for those clothes? Did you steal them? Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even her. No, Victoria, I didn't steal them. I bought them, with my own money. What money? You don't have money. Didn't have money, Margaret corrected. Past tense. Things change. The room fell silent. Emma, sensing the tension, moved closer to Margaret, slipping her small hand into her aunt's. What are you talking about? Richard's voice was sharp now, the businessman sensing a shift in power. Margaret pulled out her phone and turned it to face them, showing her bank balance. The reaction was instantaneous. Eleanor gasped. Victoria's mouth fell open. Sophia dropped her champagne. Yes, at 10 a.m. Marcus leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Richard stood up. That can't be real, Eleanor whispered. It's very real. along with the penthouse I moved into this morning, the vacation home in the Hamptons, and approximately 50 million more in various investments and properties. How? Richard demanded. How is this possible? Did you win the lottery? Is this a scam? Margaret explained about Dmitri, about the inheritance, about the boy she'd helped 30 years ago, who'd never forgotten her kindness. When she finished, the silence was deafening. Then Eleanor laughed, a high, brittle sound. Well, this is wonderful news, Margaret. We're so happy for you. Isn't this wonderful, Richard? Richard's expression was calculating. Very wonderful. Of course, you'll want to invest wisely. I can introduce you to my financial advisors. I have financial advisors. Yes, but mine have decades of experience with high net worth individuals. Like I said, I have advisors. Jonathan Whitmore of Whitmore, Stanton and Associates has set me up with an excellent team. Victoria recovered her composure, moving to Margaret with a bright smile. Aunt Margaret, I had no idea you'd been struggling so much. You should have said something. We would have helped. I did say something 20 years ago. You told me to pull myself together. That was different. How? No one had an answer. Marcus cleared his throat. So, about Emma. Obviously, we don't need you to nanny her now. But maybe you could still spend time with her. She loves you. I love Emma too, Margaret said, smiling down at the little girl. Which is why I'm going to make her a standing offer. Emma, sweetheart, you're welcome at my home any time. We can have sleepovers, bake cookies, tell stories. Would you like that? Yes. Emma squeezed her hand. Can I come today? If your parents agree. Julia, Marcus's wife, had been silent until now. She spoke up, her voice cautious. That's very generous, Margaret. We'd be happy to arrange visits. Good. Margaret turned back to the rest of the family. I also want to make something clear. This inheritance is mine. Not family money, mine. I will spend it, invest it, and donate it as I see fit. Of course, Richard said quickly. No one would suggest otherwise. Wouldn't you? Margaret met his eyes. Because I seem to remember you explaining to me at length about family responsibility and financial independence 20 years ago. So let me return the favor. I am not a bank. I am not an investment opportunity. I am not interested in funding your business ventures, your weddings, your lifestyle upgrades, or anything else. Margaret, no one is asking, Eleanor protested. Not yet, but you will. So I'm making it clear now. The answer is no. Sophia, who'd been unusually quiet, spoke up. What about charity? Don't you think you have an obligation to help people who are less fortunate? Margaret's smile was cold. Oh, I absolutely plan to donate to charity. I'm setting up a foundation to help struggling teachers and low-income families, people who actually need help and can't get it from their own families. The barb hit its mark. Eleanor flushed red. There's no need to be vindictive, Richard said. Vindictive? Margaret's voice rose for the first time. You locked me out on a terrace in the freezing cold on New Year's Eve. You've spent 20 years treating me like a burden, an embarrassment, a moral failure. You've made it clear that my poverty was my own fault, that I deserved my situation because I didn't make smart choices like you did. We never said that, Eleanor protested. You didn't have to. It was in every pitying look, every dismissive gesture, every time you forgot to save me a seat at family dinners. Every time you offered me leftovers and hand-me-downs and charity without a shred of actual care. That's not fair. What's not fair, Margaret said quietly, is that I had to spend 20 years struggling, suffering, and being humiliated by the only family I had left. What's not fair is that I begged for help once, just once, and you turned your backs. What's not fair is that you only see value in me now that I have money. The silence that followed was absolute. Emma tugged on Margaret's hand. Auntie, are you okay? Margaret's expression softened. She knelt down to Emma's level. I'm okay, sweetheart. Actually, I'm better than okay. I'm free. She stood and addressed the room one last time. I came here this morning to tell you about my inheritance in person because I thought you deserved that courtesy, and to make my boundaries clear. I will have a relationship with Emma because she's an innocent child who deserves love. But the rest of you, she looked around the room, you're going to have to earn your way back into my life, and money isn't the currency that will buy you in. Margaret, please, Eleanor said, tears in her eyes. We're family. Yes, Margaret agreed. We are, which is why this hurts so much, which is why I needed you so desperately when I had nothing, and which is why it means nothing to me that you want me now that I have everything. She walked to the door, Emma still holding her hand. Wait, Victoria called out. You can't just leave like this. We need to talk about this properly. As a family. Margaret paused. You had 20 years to talk to me as family. You chose not to. Now it's my choice, and I choose to leave. What do you want from us? Marcus demanded. An apology? Fine, we're sorry. Is that what you want to hear? Margaret looked back at him. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't afford my blood pressure medication. I had to choose between that and groceries. Did any of you know that? Did any of you care? No one answered. That's what I thought. Margaret opened the door. Goodbye. Emma, sweetheart, tell your parents when you'd like to visit me. They have my number. As she walked down the steps of the mansion, she heard Eleanor's voice, sharp and angry. She's being completely unreasonable. After everything we've done for her. Margaret didn't look back. Her driver, yes. She had a driver now, opened the car door. Where to, Mrs. Harrison? Home, Margaret said. Take me home. As the car pulled away from the mansion, Margaret's phone began buzzing. Text messages poured in. From Victoria. I think you're overreacting. We always cared about you. From Marcus. Let's have lunch this week and talk this through rationally. From Sophia. I'm getting married in June. I hope you'll still come. It would mean a lot to Dad. From Eleanor. You're hurting Richard very much. He doesn't deserve this after everything he's done for this family. From Richard himself. Margaret, call me. We need to discuss this situation before you make any rash decisions. Margaret turned off her phone. She'd spent 20 years being available to them, hoping for scraps of affection and acceptance. Now they could wait. Mrs. Harrison? Her driver said. Are you all right? Margaret looked out at the city passing by, her city now, where she belonged, where she had a home. Yes, she said. I really am. Part 4. New beginnings. The next 3 months were a whirlwind. Margaret threw herself into her new life with the energy of someone making up for lost time. She hired a personal trainer and started eating properly, not because she wanted to look a certain way, but because she could finally afford to take care of herself. The persistent ache in her joints, which she'd attributed to age, turned out to be treatable with proper medical care and a nutritionist. She traveled. First-class flights to Paris, Rome, and Barcelona. All the places Thomas had promised they'd visit someday. She cried in the Louvre, standing before paintings she'd only seen in books. She ate gelato in Florence and felt Thomas's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder, telling her it was okay to be happy. She enrolled in art classes, something she'd always wanted to do but could never afford. Turned out she had a talent for watercolors, particularly landscapes. Her teacher said she had an eye for light and shadow that comes from really seeing the world. But most importantly, she started the Margaret and Thomas Harrison Foundation for Educational Excellence. The foundation provided grants to teachers working in low-income schools, scholarships for first